Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this DemoTrans CORPTAX initiative. So it's a pleasure to have you here on board. So I see a lot of familiar faces. It's very nice to have all of you here on this meeting. So first, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Christophe de Witte. I'm a full professor at the University of Leuven, and I'm coordinating the DemoTrans project. And I would definitely like to start with thanking all of the organizers. So in particular, Vita, Mira, for organizing this event and for organizing this workshop. I guess it will be a very nice workshop in the next few hours where we're going to discuss a lot of things that deal with the DemoTrans project. And please, in the next few minutes, allow me to introduce you a little bit to the DemoTrans project. DemoTrans is a Horizon Europe project that aims to look at the interchange between democratic institutions and the globalization of the economy. And we do have a lot of ambitious goals. So first of all, we would like to encourage accountability. Look at how can we have stronger accountability? How can we foster the inclusion? How can we create sustainable democratic societies? To do so, we develop a lot of research, state-of-the-art research, such that we can build solid and robust policy recommendations. In addition, we would like to have a better understanding about governance structures. What is the relationship between governance structures and the economy? How can we create optimal mechanisms of cooperation and coordination between levels of governance? And third, we would like to offer concrete solutions to policymakers. And that's why we organize workshops like these, just to show our research, to discuss the policy recommendations, and to see, to get in touch with policymakers on what to do better and how to foster the economy, the democracy, and the social sustainability. To reach all of those ambitious goals, we have a consortium. It's a consortium of 5 partners. So KU Leuven is there with 2 research groups. We do have the University of Utrecht with multiple research groups. We do have Charles University. There is also the University of Bergen, and there is Tax Justice Network. And if you put all of us together, we do have a very nice group like you see on this picture. So it's a group with many researchers. There's also an advisory board. So some members of the advisory board are here as well. So welcome to you as well. And so there are many opportunities to see our work, as you will see. Of course, this is the start of the project. The project started in September 2020. We do have 4 years, and I would definitely recommend you to have a regular weekly update on our website. So visit our website on a weekly basis. You will find a lot of information about our initiatives, about our outputs, about news and events. And about the challenges. There are videos, project leaflets, etc. on the website. The website is www.democracytransparency.eu. If you don't want to visit the website on a weekly basis, maybe you can follow us on our Twitter account. Our Twitter account has the account @DemoTrans. And on the account, you will find all of our initiatives. So the workshops, the conferences that we organize, the policy briefs we distribute, etc. You will also find a lot of research that we did in the past. So each of the consortium members showcased a little bit the type of research that you can expect from us. So this is, for instance, a paper that I co-authored with Vita, who's going to present today, and Benny, who's going to present today as well. So you will find further information on our Twitter accounts on this. You can also stay in touch by following us on LinkedIn. So there is really no excuse not to follow us. So both 3 ways already are available. And on the LinkedIn website, you will find exactly the same things as you find on the Twitter account, just with more characters and more words. But please follow us on LinkedIn as well, because you will find things like, for instance, the policy briefs. So at the moment, we do have already 2 policy briefs, 2 summaries of research that came from the DemoTrans project. For instance, the first one is together with Giovanna Di Verno and Francisco Vodelli, where we look at sustainable budgeting. How can you create sustainable budgeting? What is the impact of a balanced budget rule on municipalities, on government, and on efficiency? The second policy brief is, for instance, on mergers, because in many European systems, we do have a lot of discussion about mergers. Should we have a larger municipal areas? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Both in terms of economic effect, but also in terms of democratic effect, in terms of management effects, etc. The policy briefs aim to summarize the research a bit so that you have a good idea in a few pages on what we did in the past. That's basically the introduction of the DemoTrans project. The DemoTrans project is one of the reasons we are here together. And so please follow us in the next few years and maybe beyond. But definitely follow the seminar today. And I'm very glad to hand over the floor to Pieter, who's going to introduce you a little bit to the seminar today.
Thank you, Christoph, for the excellent introduction, and I hope everybody feels welcome now by DemoTrans. And let me provide another welcome note from CORPTAX, a research group focused on corporate taxation in Prague that is member of DemoTrans. And I hope that you will enjoy the workshop, whether you are online now with us on YouTube or via Zoom, or whether you are watching the recording later on. And if you're enjoying the workshop that is to come, you might check out our 3 previous virtual workshops, that recordings of which we have online on our CORPTAX website. So we in CORPTAX, we mostly deal with corporate taxation, but DemoTrans is about much more, as outlined by Christoph. What we want to do in this specific workshop is to cover 2 topics in detail and to show how the 2 are interconnected. So we focus on inequalities in corporate taxation, and we focus on inequalities in public procurement. And the final presentation of the day, for those who will stay until around 4:30, we'll see how we are able to connect very specifically in one research paper the 2 topics together and show the inequalities present in both. So I hope we will all enjoy the workshop, and without further ado, let me pass on the floor to the moderator of the first half of the workshop, who is my colleague, Miroslav Polanski.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction words, Christoph and Peter. Very nicely. So let's jump into the first session. The first session is titled inequalities in corporate taxation, and we have 4 papers in total. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We have 15 minutes per paper for the presentation itself, and then we will have a 20-minute window or a slot for discussion. So save your questions for that period. We'll have a few opening words by Christoph for the 4 papers. And first up, we have Kristin Delani Nadaraya, who is from CORPTAX, our colleague here in Prague, with a paper that is co-authored by a few other people in this call. And I will give the word to Kristin now. If you can share your screen, hopefully it works.
Yep, let me have a go.
Perfect.
Can you see it? Great. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and yeah, very excited to share this research with you. It's still in its very early stages, but we have some, at least a good start. So I think, some feedback would be great. And been excited about this project. So it's called "Does Tax Avoidance Make Large Firms Larger?" Looking at the connection between tax avoidance and industry concentration. So it's co-authored with Matej Bajgar, Petr Jansky, and Timon Twinsma. Hope I said it all correctly. So the main motivation is we've seen with a lot of recent research that there's been, at least there's a lot more literature now on profit shifting and tax avoidance, but it's also showing a tendency that it might be increasing, or and also there's a lot of papers indicating that there is increased industry concentration, like these 2 papers by Grillon and Bajgar. And then there's also been research connecting these 2, but not very much. It's not a well-researched topic, connecting these 2, like the effects or the benefits from tax avoidance and the possible effects that can have on the economy, or here we focus on industry concentration. So yeah, is there a competitive advantage from tax avoidance? And the paper by Martin et al., they did find that there was that relationship, that tax avoidance might lead to more industry concentration, but they were this was based on Compustat data for US multinationals. So that motivates us to look more into European firms. Do we see the same relationship in Europe or generally other places in the world? But yeah, so our research question is whether tax avoidance has contributed to increasing industry concentration in Europe using Orbis data. And to do this, estimate this, we developed an instrumental variable estimation strategy to try and model this relationship using 3 different instruments. And yeah, like I said, using Orbis data for multinational corporations. It has both unconsolidated data and consolidated data, which is quite beneficial for this research and for European countries between 2010 and 18. So our hypothesis originally is that a smaller tax bill, tax avoidance, might help firms have larger net profits, which then, or potentially also lower costs because they are paying lower taxation. This might help them to acquire more companies or invest more back into the firm, or also potentially lower prices, which can all contribute to larger firm size. So this is what we're trying to estimate in this direction. But of course, there's the issue that larger companies might also be more likely to then, again, use more tax avoidance strategies if there is a high fixed cost. But we're trying to develop an estimation approach that, that follows this line approach. This is from recent World Bank data that looked at average ETRs, and it's not quite consistent with our hypothesis, but yeah, it shows a quite nonlinear relationship. For our data, if we look at the difference between the bottom quartile and the top percentile in terms of average effective tax rate, there's quite a difference. It's not necessarily that the larger top firms, this is based on sales, so the largest firms in terms of sale or the bottom quartile, but the larger firms are not necessarily paying always lower tax, but it's fluctuating a lot more, whereas quite consistently the bottom quartile is quite stable or a bit under 30% in terms of effective tax rate. So yeah, definitely something to look more into. So our data has consists of 6,000 multinational corporations that has more than 100,000 subsidiaries. And our most important variable, effective tax rate, which we use as a proxy for tax avoidance, because it's the best way with the available data to estimate or have some proxy for tax avoidance. And this we define as the corporate income taxation over operating profits. We could also have try and use a few different ones following the Garcia-Bernando paper, which Petr Jansky was a co-author of, and also adding some financial profit variables as well. But this is mostly what we're using. So yeah, looking at the data, we have excluded all loss-making firms for this for now. And it's very skewed, the data, as you can see. And the average tax rate for all firms for all years is 29%. So yeah. And then our estimation strategy, we follow this estimating equation where we use sales as firm size or as a indicator of firm size, and then tax avoidance. As I said, we use ETR to estimate that. And then the estimating equation is using a range of control variables and firm fixed effects and country, industry, year fixed effects. And the first stage is quite simply a weighted average ETR with fixed effects. And we estimate that as follows. So it's in a few steps. So we take each country industry pair and take the weighted average ETR of that. But it's and we combine it with the sales share that each country industry pair has in their industries. Or in the country and years. And then we get the weighted ETR combining these things. Hope that's clear. And yeah, so when we estimate our first stage, we get very strong results. So it's a strong indication that we have a strong instrument. And that is with that stays consistent for all the different fixed effects. So yeah, good indication that we have a strong instrument, but we still need more robustness checks or checks for endogeneity. The same also holds when we do it without taking out where the MNCs are, if the subsidiary is in the same country as the headquarter country. But yeah, for all the different checks that we did, we get the same results for the instrument, with it being quite significant. So yeah, this is at least our results for now. And then it's about taking it further to the second stage and looking better at it. But this is what we have for now. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. Very interesting. Happy to see that, you know, such rich data is exploited for the purposes that we care about, topics that we care about. So it's very good to see such efforts. Okay, let's move on to the second paper of this session, which is titled Foreign Direct Investment, Economic Growth in Tax Havens. So we're staying very much in the same area with Benny guys from BI Norwegian Business School presenting. Please, Benny, you have 15 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. This is under the same conditions as the previous paper, very much work in progress at a very early stage, so don't cite me on anything that I'm going to say. So this is about basically foreign direct investments and how they relate to economic growth. Generally, there's an assumption that if there's more foreign direct investment, that's a good thing for economic growth in a certain country. Now, what I want to look at here is whether that relation holds in tax havens. So usually we think about foreign direct investments as a productive thing, while the things that, or the money that goes into tax havens is not necessarily productive. So trying to see whether this relation between foreign direct investment and economic growth is different depending on the tax haven status of a particular country, under the assumption sort of that there's less likely to be productive investments being channeled into tax havens. So this is at the very, I can't move my slides. This is at the very starting point of where we are. So I think there is a lot of literature so far that suggests that foreign direct investments will spur economic growth through a range of mechanisms. And a lot of these mechanisms have been documented in a quite a long variety of studies since at least the 1980s. Much of that goes through technology flows or skill flows or knowledge flows. Most of the technology arguments are based on productivity things, but for that, obviously, we need that the investments that are being made are productive in an economic sense, right? Now, despite the amount of arguments being made theoretically that this link is going to exist, the empirical evidence is quite mixed. So if you look at the last 20, 30 years of literature discussing this relationship between foreign direct investment and economic growth, you see that a lot of studies find results and a lot of studies find non-results. And that has triggered in the last 10, 15 years or so a discussion about moderating factors that either strengthen or weaken this kind of relationship. And there's been arguments made about the absorptive capacity of the country. So if the country is not large enough and its economy cannot actually absorb all the foreign direct investments that come in, then that's not going to translate anymore into economic growth. So there's sort of an upward effect that foreign direct investment will generate economic growth, but at some point that's going to level off because there's not more that the economy can actually accommodate. The same thing is being said about the development of financial markets. You need a rich financial sector to be able to absorb all that money and distribute it as effectively and efficiently as possible. And then there's arguments about different types of FDI. Some are more productive than others. And that's sort of the argument that I'm going to rely on here, that there's certain types of foreign direct investment which are more likely to go into tax havens that are likely to be less productive. So tax havens do obviously attract a lot of financial flows, and a lot of that is documented as foreign direct investment. But a substantial share of that might be, and I put that in quotation marks here because we cannot necessarily be certain about that, might be motivated by tax avoidance. Right? If that is the case, then you get what often has been called ghost FDI, which is not necessarily productive in an economic sense. And if that is the case, then the relation between FDI and economic growth will weaken. So that leads to basically the main research question that we have in the back of our minds here is that what is the economic impact of FDI inflows in tax havens, if there is any left, right? So that's going to sort of depend on the productivity of the inflows that is there. And I'm going to assume that if a country is a stronger tax haven, that more of the inflows will be unproductive, and that hence the relationship between FDI and economic growth is going to weaken. I sort of mentioned this already, but obviously there's a vast academic literature on this relationship between FDI and economic growth, dating back at least to 1993. And more recently, there's more discussion about these moderating factors, and that is more where this project tends to lean into, in the sense that we want to see whether this relationship differs under certain circumstances, namely with the characteristics of the country where the money is flowing into. So the main theoretical argument, or our starting assumption, is that FDI is a good thing in general. So it will foster economic growth if these are productive investments. Now, the caveat here obviously is about the productivity of the investment. So we're gonna assume that tax havens, while they offer strong fiscal incentives to attract foreign money, that there is going to be variation in what is going to be flowing into these tax havens, because the scope for tax avoidance is going to depend on the institutional framework of the tax haven itself. Some are much more lenient towards the money that come in compared to others. If you compare the fiscal system of the Bahamas or Bermuda, for instance, with the Belgian system, both of which are tax havens to some extent, there's going to be a huge leeway in the institutional legal framework that is there, and that is going to determine the types of FDI that are going to be flowing into these countries. The more lenient or fiscally lenient the country is, the more non-productive FDI inflows are likely to flow in, which are referred to as ghost inflows. So the hypothesis then becomes that the tax haven status of a particular country, so how flexible it is on a number of criteria in the legal and institutional sense, the more ghost FDI will flow in, and then the relationship between, or the productive relationship between FDI and economic growth should decline. So how do we look at that? Well, this is where this is the basic idea. So how do we try to look into that? So far, we've started collecting data. So everything that follows now is very preliminary. We have data on the corporate tax haven score, which has been developed by the Tax Justice Network, which is part of the DemoTrans project. So that is very nice. The data that we have now are for 64 countries in 2019, which have been evaluated on a range of indicators. There's about 20 of them, which include tax rates that Christian has just talked about, legal exclusions about paying taxes, exemptions, transparency rules, all these kind of things. And that's being merged into one measure that is indicating how much a country is actually a tax haven or not. That's a score that ranges from 0 to 100, but for the 64 countries that we have available, the lowest one is about 31, I think, and the highest one is 100. In 2021, that's why it's in gray. There's been an update of the data, and there's 70 countries now, but we haven't collected those data yet. We're just hoping to add them to the data set soon enough. So then we have, obviously, we want to look at the relation between economic growth and foreign direct investment. So the dependent variable is going to be the year-on-year change in real GDP per capita, which comes from the World Bank. That's going to be related to the value of inward foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP, which comes from the United Nations. And then we're going to see whether that relation between those two variables changes depending on the tax haven score of a particular country. Assuming that if the tax haven score is very low, the effect is going to be strong and positive, but then it's going to weaken and possibly turn negative as we add more tax haven status. We're still working on the control variables, so we want to at some point include controls, obviously, but that's things like population size, the Human Development Index. We're still collecting those data and adding them to the data set as we speak, so that will not be included just yet. The baseline empirical model in this case is going to be fairly simple. We're going to have GDP growth on the left-hand side. Foreign direct investment is on the right-hand side. And then we have this interaction term with a tax haven score, which goes from 30 to the weak tax havens to 100 for the very strong tax havens. Given this interaction term, the coefficients beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 are the ones that are of interest here. So if you think about a tax haven score of 0, then basically this part is gone, that part is gone, and we just have beta 2. So that's going to be the baseline relation between GDP growth and FDI when the country is not a tax haven. So that's sort of the general framework that we usually think about. And then as a tax haven score goes up, both this beta 1 goes up and the beta 3 goes up more and more. Right? So this beta 3 is going to reflect how this baseline relation between FDI and economic growth gradually changes when we add more and more tax haven status to a country, which will allow us to see whether FDI is better or worse for economic growth when countries become more aggressive on their fiscal tax avoidance stance. So this is very preliminary findings based on the data that we have so far. So in terms of the interpretations that I just said, if you look at the top coefficient here, that's going to be where FDI is equal to 0. So that is not very meaningful. That's when there's no FDI coming into a country. So we can basically ignore that one. The second one is the coefficient of FDI. That's going to be the case where tax haven score equals 0. So for non-fiscal havens, this is the effect that we observe between FDI and economic growth, which is positive and statistically significant. So that means that if more FDI comes into a country, economic growth tends to increase, right? For countries that are not tax havens. Now, the interaction here is negative and also statistically significant, which is going to imply that this basic relation that I just talked about, this 1.39, the positive effect of FDI on growth, is gradually going to weaken when I get more FDI flowing into a tax haven. So the more a country is a tax haven, the weaker the relation between FDI and economic growth tends to become. And now I can't see what the numbers actually are. So when the tax haven score is at its maximum value, namely 100, you multiply this thing with 100 and then subtract it here, then the effect actually becomes negative. So at some point, this positive relation between FDI and GDP is gonna change, especially for the super strict tax havens. I mean, the ones that are on the extreme positive end of the spectrum here. So the 2 stars here is not significance levels. Do not cite me on this yet, because we obviously have to check for extra data and control variables, but it seems to be, at least this is a motivation to keep the project going, that there seems to be this relationship going that is actually as we would expect it to be. So I would say there's some preliminary, very preliminary, but at least suggestive evidence that tax havens are attracting more unproductive FDI. Clearly, if that were not the case, then this relationship between FDI and economic growth would be roughly stable. Clearly, that is not the case based on these initial results. But there's a number of limitations to what we have. Of course, there's a very small sample. I have only 64 countries so far, and the smallest tax havens, we don't have necessarily FDI and economic growth data available. So that makes things a bit more complicated. We have to figure out how to get those smaller ones into the data. We don't have the control variables in there yet, and we want to look at a longer time period, which we have for 2021, for instance. We need to extend the data set beyond the tax haven list. Obviously, the data we have now are only tax havens as of a certain level, but other countries, I mean, there's 64 countries there, so there's 120 missing. The problem with those is how do we get them into that scale without having an actual tax haven score? And for that, we're looking into alternative measures of tax haven status. And in that respect, the first paper was quite interesting because it suggests that effective tax rates might actually be an indicator here that we could use more directly. And for those, we know that there's a much longer time period available, so we could explore that in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Benny. Very, very, very interesting. And I see so many potential synergies there, not only in this consortium, but also with even in this within this this workshop itself, within this session itself. Because next we move on to Valeria Secchini, who is our colleague from CORPTAX, who will be giving us insights into how multinationals actually do this. How do they structure themselves in order to be able to pay lower effective tax rates in tax havens? Please, Valeria. You're muted still.
Okay.
Perfect.
Now you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Mirek, for the introduction. And yeah, so happy to be here talking about the project carrying out with Javier Garcia Bernardo. Still in a work in progress, but I'm happy to show you the results that we have until now. So the project is called Revealing the Link Between Corporate Structure and Tax Avoidance using hierarchical Markov models. And in this project, we try and need to understand which are the patterns of countries used by multinational corporations to shift profits into tax havens. So we know that multinational corporations shift profits from the countries in which made those profits to the tax havens to avoid paying taxes in the initial countries. But the pattern, the path that they use to shift profits to tax haven in general is not as direct as in this picture, but it could look more something like that. So, for example, multinational in France shift profits to the Netherlands, then to Ireland, and India to Cyprus. And so this is what we are trying to do and to understand in our project. We're trying to understand which are these patterns of countries. And we know that they manage to perform all of that through a complex network of subsidiaries located all in different countries. So here we have an example of a corporate structure. Here we have in the middle the parent companies. So each node basically is a firm. The parent company is the middle, and then we have all the subsidiaries to which it is connected to. Their own subsidiaries, and then we have the subsidiary. So shifting profits from a subsidiary to another, if they're located in different countries, means also shifting profits from a country to another. So we have information about these corporate structures in Orbis, the global ownership data. And in particular, in the 2017 data, we have around 50,000 public listed parent companies. And so we have information on their corporate structure, so about their connection with the subsidiaries and the location of the subsidiaries. And this is the 2017 is the one that we will focus on, the data set that we will focus on. And so from this Orbis data has been already obtained the first order ownership network. So what does this mean? Basically, we go from all the structures of multinationals in which we have firms as nodes to aggregated data in which instead we have nodes that are countries. So each node is a country, and we have the edges that are ownership relations. What does it mean? For example, the edge pointing from the Netherlands to Cyprus tells us the rate of Dutch firms owning subsidiaries in Cyprus. So how can we go from the corporate structure to the corporate structures to this first order ownership network? So let's say that here we have a simplified example of a corporate structure. So we have the parent companies on the left in the US, and then it has a subsidiary in the Netherlands, and this subsidiary also owns other two subsidiaries in the Netherlands, and so on. So what we do is to construct chains going from the parent company to the headquarters, so to the every final subsidiaries. And so, for example, here we have the first chain as so representing the sequence of ownership, the country sequence of ownership. So we have US, Netherlands, Netherlands, then we have US, Netherlands, Netherlands, Russia, and so on. So this is what we do for every corporate structure, for all the network of the corporate structure, and for every multinational. And then we aggregate the data and we understand the relationship between the countries. So the firms in the countries. So in particular here we have, for example, we see that all the US firms end up having subsidiaries in the Netherlands. So we connect US and the Netherlands with an edge of a weight of 100%. Instead, if we look at the Netherlands, so at Dutch firms, we can see that we have 5 possible outcomes, 5 possible subsidiaries for Dutch firms. So in particular, we have 3 of them end up again in the Netherlands, so have subsidiaries in the Netherlands. So we're talking about 3 on 5, so 60%. And this is one edge. And then we have 1 on 5 Dutch firms, they have subsidiaries in Russia, so we have a 20%, and another 1 on 5 in Cyprus, so again a 20%. So this is how we construct the first order ownership network. However, from this first order ownership network is difficult to understand the patterns of countries that are indeed used, what we are looking for basically. So this is why we go from a first order perspective to a higher order one. So in a first order network, as we've seen, we look at one node, for example, M, and we look at the probability to go from M to X and from M to Y. For example, here we have 50% of 50%. In a higher order perspective instead, we also look at the previous steps. So this means that I am in M, but I also include the information that I have been previously in A. So I come from A before arriving in M. And this can change our final probability, our distribution of probabilities. So the probability to end up to X or Y. What does this mean in our network? So looking at the previous steps means looking at the firms that own the firms we are looking at. So for example, again, we're looking at the Dutch firms, but we consider the Dutch firms that are owned by other Dutch firms, okay? And so, for example, we are looking, in this case, at these 3. These are the 3 Dutch firms owned by themselves, by other Dutch firms. And we can see basically that we have only 2 outcomes. One is, so we have either a Dutch firm that is owning a subsidiary in Russia and one in Cyprus. So in this case, instead of 20 and 20% as we had before, we have 50% of subsidiaries for these Dutch firms in Cyprus and 50% of probability for this Dutch firm to have subsidiary in Russia. Instead, if we are looking at the Dutch firms owned by US firms, then we are looking at these three, and they all end up having firms in the Netherlands again, having subsidiary in the Netherlands again. Okay, so this is how we construct the distributions of probabilities for the lower and the higher order. So basically, we also go further. So we have seen this is the first order, this is the second order, but we also go further. We also look at various previous steps, 3 steps ahead or 4 steps ahead, and so on. So we construct the various distribution, and then we have to understand if these higher orders are indeed significant in our data, if they truly describe our dataset. And to do that, we start from the model that has been developed by Xu et al. in the paper representing higher order dependencies in network. However, we adapt the model to have good performance metrics on our dataset. So to really be effective on our dataset. And to do that, so if in their own model, they just consider the distance, a measure of distance between the two distribution of the lower and the higher order, we also introduce in our model a measure of the reliability of the higher order. And also we consider the rate of appearance, or how many times the higher and the lower order appear in the data. I won't go deeper in the model, describing the model, just for the sake of time. But if you have questions about that, I will be happy to show you and to answer. So what is important to know is that we create synthetic data based on our dataset, on the Orbis dataset, to test the model. So we introduce synthetic higher orders inside this synthetic data, and we look at how many are found and how many false positives we have too. So, and we have good performance metrics on our dataset. We can see we have good performance metrics on our dataset with our model. And so when we apply our model to the true dataset, to the Orbis dataset, we find around 70 higher orders, so 70 patterns of countries, around 70 patterns of country, and more than 75% of them contain at least a country defined as tax 7. So here we have some examples of higher orders that we find. So for example, Netherlands, Great Britain, Luxembourg, which means this is an ownership relations as usual. So this means that the Dutch firm owns a subsidiary in UK, which itself owns another subsidiary in Luxembourg. So following always this logic, we also have Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Netherlands, Russia, China, Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Cyprus, Russia, Canada, Cayman Islands, South Africa, Mauritius. So these are the results we have until now. Then we have some next steps that we want to perform. And so is to connect the decreasing of the effective tax rate of companies with the higher order that are present in their corporate structure. And we want to do that, we do that through loss regression. And so what we do is basically compare the effective tax rate of each company with the higher orders that are present in their corporate structures, among, of course, the higher order that we have found in the global data. And we indeed see from preliminary results that some higher orders manage to decrease the effective tax rate when used by companies. And for example, here we have Netherlands, Switzerland, Netherlands, so always Dutch firm owning a Swiss firm, which owns Netherlands subsidiary in the Netherlands. So this decreases the ETR of 1.7%. Then we have this interesting one. So US unknown country. So unknown location of the firm is 1.9, a decreasing of 1.9% of the effective tax rate. And then we have Netherlands, US, Luxembourg, decreases the ATR of 1.5%. So To conclude, we in our project want to find the patterns of country used by multinational corporations to shift their profits into tax havens, and to do that, we look for the higher order dependencies in the ownership data and Orbis data, developing a model to find them with performance metrics. In the end, on the Orbis data, we obtain around 70 patterns of countries in the company's structures, and around 75% of them contains tax havens. Also, from some preliminary results, we can see that the effective tax rate of companies decreases because of some of these patterns. So thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your question. Happy to hear your questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Valeria. There's some fascinating results and research. Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on to the last presentation of the session before we make sure that we go through all the questions that we've noted down. At least I have a bunch already. The last presenter of the session is Marek Shedivi, who is also our colleague here at CORPTAX, talking about corporate tax avoidance and within-country inequality. Please, Marek, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Hopefully you can see my screen. And yeah, excuse me, as Marek just mentioned, my name is Marek Shedivi. I'm a PhD candidate at Charles University, and I'm going to present a joint work with Petr, in which we study the possible effects of corporate tax avoidance on within-country inequality, and to present in more detail what we are aiming to do. I'm going to rely on this simple graphic of just a standard economy in which we have an individual who gets his wage, he gets capital income, he gets transfers, which sum up to his total income, and he uses the income to pay taxes, or he can invest in assets, or he can consume what he doesn't pay in taxes or decides to invest in assets. And I'm going to rely on this graph to show how the existence of tax havens can affect our ability to measure inequality in this simple framework, and where we step in because we think the evidence is lacking so far. So one aspect, the first one, in which our ability to measure inequality might be affected is simply the individuals holding assets in tax havens and thus not declaring them. So basically, the existence of tax havens would prevent us from accurately measuring the size of the assets in the economy. And if these were not misreported equally over the distribution, this might result in us underestimating the level of inequality. Second mechanism through which tax havens can influence inequality in this framework comes from the side of the government. So this means that basically, with the existence of tax havens and some assets hidden in tax havens and firms operating via tax havens, the government is just unable to touch certain assets or certain income because these don't have to be disclosed thanks to the existence of tax havens. So that's the first order effect. And the second order effect would be that the government relies on multiple instruments to affect the distribution of income and wealth in the society, but these instruments might be affected by tax havens' existence. So, for example, there's some evidence that the corporate tax incidence might be affected, and might be different for firms operating in tax havens than for firms operating in non-tax havens countries. And third, and here comes the connection from the operation of multinationals to actual within country inequality, so inequality between individuals in a given society, and that's that the firms operating in tax havens might be able to generate higher profits thanks to profit shifting. However, once they achieve these higher profits, they have to decide what will they do with the extra profit earned. And there are multiple things they can do. So first, they can just take the extra profit and pay it out in terms of wages to the employees. So this would affect inequality in labor income and overall income inequality. Or they can either retain the profits or reinvest them, which would affect wealth inequality, or they can decide to pay it out to the individuals either through dividends or interest, and this would affect capital income, thus influencing income inequality. And there already is some evidence on these possible mechanisms. So first, the first one I described is the effect on the inequality in the static sense. So in the inequality, the level of inequality we can measure in the society. And there's some evidence in these 3 papers, which I have in the presentation, which are done on data for Scandinavia, Netherlands, and Colombia. And the authors indeed find that tax evasion is more concentrated at the top, as we might expect, which indeed affects our ability to accurately measure inequality. And if we don't take into account existence of tax havens, we would be underestimating inequality in the society. The second effect, which was the effect on the fiscal capacity, or in general on the government's ability to affect the distribution of resources in the society, was studied in a recent paper by Petr and Bilicka and Evgenia Dubinina. And the tax incidence question was studied in a recent paper by Fust, where indeed they found that the tax incidence differs between firms that have a connection to tax havens and those that don't. And finally, there's the connection between the profit shifting of multinational companies and the within country distribution of income and wealth, which I have discussed as the last point, and which I have here split into the third and fourth point. And the third point, which is the situation in which the companies have higher profit thanks to profit shifting, and they decide to distribute it via wages, was studied in a recent paper by Alstad-Sutter and her co-authors, and they indeed found that firms that have multinationals that have connections to tax havens, pay on average 2% higher wages, and this is more prevalent for people at the top of the wage distribution. So indeed, the existence of tax havens seems to be feeding labor income inequality and thus income inequality. However, there is little to no evidence on the effect of tax havens on capital income inequality. So that's where we want to step in with Petr and provide novel evidence. So basically, we want to study the extent to which the existence of tax havens affects income inequality or wealth inequality. The first one in the situation where the extra profits are paid out in terms of dividends or interest, or the second, which is the wealth, in terms of the profits are retained. And as far as we know, there is no evidence on this yet. And the closest papers to study this are these 3, which study the the heterogeneity in returns to assets. However, none of these has tackled the question of how the heterogeneity, to which extent the heterogeneity is driven by presence of tax havens in the system. And there are three ways in which we can go, or which we think we can go about the identification. Here ranked from the simplest to the most robust, where the simplest one, the first one, would simply rely on taking an indicator of income or wealth inequality on the left side, and on the right hand side have an indicator of the exposure of the extent of exposure of the specific economy to tax havens, and compare the evolution between countries of inequality between countries with high and low levels of exposure to tax havens. However, this would be a cross-country regression, which might be problematic for a variety of reasons. So, in a second step, what we can do, we can rely on household level survey data, which are readily available, and we can look actually at within countries at the level of individual households, and compare the growth in wealth or in capital income for households with different levels of share of financial assets and intensity. So varying the level to which their own portfolio is composed of financial assets, where financial assets are the medium through which the extra profits from the companies would accrue to the ultimate owners. And finally, which is the third point, we could rely on a combination of the approaches done by Alstad and three papers on the heterogeneity in returns to assets, and look at the actual structure of the portfolios and how this is to which extent the portfolio is exposed to tax havens, and how this connects to the recorded returns. However, for this we would need administrative data, which we don't have yet. So that's hopefully to come. And in the rest of the presentation, I will provide you with just some indicative evidence. So I won't be claiming causality in any way, relying on the first approach. And to do that, I will rely on the Luxembourg Wealth Survey data, which provides household level survey data for 60 countries and over 60 country combinations. And the nice thing about this data is that it records both the structure of assets the household owns. So we have data on bonds and stocks and other equity. And we have also data on detailed data on income. So we have data on both factor income, so labor income, capital income, and we have data on the structure of capital income, so interest, dividends, and rental income. And what we can do, we can just have a look at the extent to which inequality in either income or wealth correlates with the level to which the country is exposed to tax havens. So here on the horizontal axis, we have the share of investment by citizens of a given country in tax havens. And on the vertical axis, we have inequality. And looking at capital income, we can see that there seems to be little to no relationship. However, as I've said, this is just an exploratory analysis. Similarly, we can look at assets, and we find that for total assets, financial assets, non-financial assets, and we find that the relationship is the weakest for financial assets, where we would actually suspect that the relationship should be the strongest. And there are multiple reasons for this. The first one is that wealth, especially financial wealth, is difficult to measure and might be misreported in a wealth survey. Similarly, capital income, if we take the Gini, just looking at the values at the vertical axis, the capital income is extremely concentrated in countries. And again, similarly to wealth income might be misreported. So this is, as I just to repeat, this is exploratory. We are not claiming causality yet, and we will have to rely on more robust ways to study this. That being said, I'm looking forward to any comments, and it's all from me. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Marek. Okay, so that was our 4 presenters. I would now like to invite Christoph for some opening words to our discussion before opening the floor up for questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. This is very interesting work, and I see many extremely promising DemoTrans papers rising at the horizon. So thanks a lot for that. And I see also many complementary points in the set of 4 papers. So first, Benny demonstrated that the tax havens attract unproductive FDI, sorry, not FDH, FDI. Kristen suggested that the tax avoidance lead to increased industry concentration. Marek's results indicate that tax avoidance result in higher within country inequality. And as shown by Valeria, the Netherlands and Luxembourg were central nodes in her analysis. This is of course in line with what Benny said in the Tax Justice Network Index. So in this index, the Netherlands is at place 4, Luxembourg is at place 6, Ireland is at place 11. So my question now to basically all of you, because as DemoTrans is an impact-driven project, we are developing the research as we do now in order to provide robust policy recommendations. And I fully realize that your work is still preliminary, so even 2 asterisks by Benny. But still, the question is, what policy advices could you give to the European Commission in your work? And can you discuss in particularly a little bit on the policy implications that it would apply for the economy and the democracy in EU tax havens, such as the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Ireland? Please, floor is yours. Maybe Valeria, you can start, or Marek, or Benny, doesn't matter.
Hi. So thank you very much, Christoph. So yeah, for sure, like one of the ideas behind our project is indeed to understand which are the flows inside the legislations that allow, especially the Netherlands, Luxembourg. We have seen a lot of European tax havens inside the higher orders to indeed be so important for corporation is tax avoidance. Surely, like more transparency is for sure one of the keys that maybe could help in this sense. Other than the effective tax rate, one of the things that we would like to understand, apart from the decreasing of the effective tax rate, is maybe some kind of correlation with the financial secrecy index of the higher orders. This is one of, for example, the ideas we have, because maybe like these patterns not only manage to decrease their tax rate directly, so just because, for example, the Netherlands is a favorable corporate tax, but also it could be also because maybe it has high secrecy in the legislation that allow them to move profits into the tax havens, other kind of tax havens, maybe little islands and so on. So yeah, surely this is one important point to look at. Yes, yes.
Marek or Kristin or Benny, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I would tend to agree that transparency obviously becomes an important issue here. I think part of what I'm interested in is not just that this economic growth is being affected. I don't think even if you have ghost FDI that goes into a country, or unproductive FBI, that doesn't necessarily not have GDP implications, because there will be a service industry and there will be a financial center set up, so other people getting employment. It's just that the types of economic activity might be shifted and distorted, which I think might be a negative thing that comes out here, and that is possibly or likely, I think, one of the main drivers of this reversal that I seem to observe in the data so far. And then I guess it's not necessarily just following where the financial flows go, but that from a policy perspective, you also have to figure out how to stop the type of distortions that are being generated by that within the countries that are the receiving countries, such as the Netherlands and Ireland, which shift away from certain types of activity towards other ones. And we have to sort of figure out and take into account what kind of broader implications those things will have for the next steps of economic growth.
Thank you. I think there is a theme that keeps sort of recurring in my head when I listen to basically all four of these papers. Maybe Marek's a bit less than the others, but there are companies that engage in tax avoidance. There are companies that don't do so much, at least not so much. And what, Valeria, maybe a quick question to you, and then how that would relate to Marek's and Kristen's and Benny's papers is, do you see a potential as an outcome of your paper, perhaps, a firm level measure of the tax aggressiveness of firms, you could call that? Or, so if a company is structured the way it is structured, it has a higher order chain in its ownership structure, which is associated with, large decreases in ETRs. It is a firm level, another firm level metric of the potential or risk of that company engaging in tax avoidance, right? So Kristen in her paper has used ETR as a measure of an indicator of tax avoidance. We have used similar indicators in our paper with Christoph and Time and Peter and Vita. And we have also been using, and I know other papers have been using, the fact that they even have tax haven subsidiaries as a sort of, an indicator or an event, even an event study design on what happens when firms start tax avoiding. So Valeria, my question to you is, what do you envision as the final output of that paper? Is it something like this? Is it something that could be usable to improve perhaps the other papers that we've seen in the session?
So yeah, indeed, it's one of the possible developments in truth, because once we have connected higher orders with the effective tax rate, the decreasing of the effective tax rate, or also the financial secrecy index, then we can also look at if these higher orders are more present in singular firms, in singular corporations. So if in a corporate structures, of a multinational, we find a lot of these higher orders and linked to low effective tax rate or financial secrecy index, then we can also look at the multinational singular case. Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. What do you think about firm level metrics of tax avoidance? Would you like to use some other ones, or is that something you plan on doing?
No, I think that would be very helpful, and also to see the characteristics of that company if you look at the firm level, to understand a bit better what a tax aggressive firm looks like, and to understand that better, to understand tax avoidance. I think that sounds like a great idea and a good development.
Yep. I see Benny with a raised hand. Please go ahead.
This falls under smaller and less general comments while I'm trying to figure out how to lower my hand. So the first paper by Kristen I thought was very interesting, and also the fact that you use these effective tax rates to estimate tax avoidance. One of the reasons is I might want to do that myself. So I'm wondering why that is a good measure for tax avoidance if you have a cross-country setting. I guess within one country that makes some sense, because then the tax rate, the nominal tax rate, will be fixed. But if you think about different countries, the nominal tax rates will be different. So the effective, wouldn't it make sense to look at sort of the distance between the nominal tax rate that's in the law and the effective tax rate that we actually observe, to take some of this cross-country variation in the level of nominal taxes out of the system? Maybe that's already done by having country fixed effects. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but I'm sort of thinking that, is this effective tax rate in itself a good enough measure for tax avoidance, or do we have to adjust it in some way? And then the second point that I was thinking about, you mentioned at some point that you exclude loss-making firms. Now, I understand that loss-making firms cannot pay taxes. That is great, but a lot of firms, they produce losses in order to carry those forward and not pay taxes in the future. So I'm wondering how you deal with that, because that seems like a way to generate tax avoidance in the future by just piling up losses in one year and then just carrying them forward.
Do I reply to it straight away? Thank you for those great questions. I think, I'll start with the last one first. I think this is a very good point. I'm also a bit worried about excluding the loss-making firms, but I think it's more a temporary fix. The issue of including them is what it does to the ETR. So it causes a lot of problems for us in the estimation, and that's the main reason. But like you're saying, there's evidence of a lot of big companies that produce losses on purpose, many places, as a tax avoiding strategy. So yeah, I think this is a place where we really need to figure out what to do. And in terms of ETR being a good enough proxy, I don't think it will capture. It will not be able to capture only a small part of it, for sure. But it's data availability, and hopefully we do hope that the country fixed effects do make up, like you said, a bit of the differences in tax rates. But we do have a second and third instrument. At least our third instrument, we're going to use STRs, actual tax rates, instead of the ETR, and combining it with other data. So maybe that will also help us with that. But yeah, there are some challenges, but I think it's mostly because it's the easiest one to do for now. But yeah.
Thank you, Christoph. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I do have actually also a different question, maybe a little bit in line with the earlier one, but it seems like a very tricky equilibrium, the tax havens. So on the one hand, as Kristen indicated, tax havens, they can create lower costs. On the other hand, if you look at the US Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, they really want more industry concentration, and they want more FDI, even if it's unproductive. So to Benny and Kristen, how do you see this equilibrium? Is this really like an equilibrium, or do you want to avoid all this tax haven purposes, etc.? So Benny, you have the honor to start.
Yeah, I was afraid that was going to happen. Yes, I don't see this necessarily as an equilibrium. I think it's just going to, certainly not a long-term equilibrium. I sort of have the same feeling that came with Miroslav's question about this firm-level tax aggressiveness, because clearly that's going to be good for the firm to be more aggressive, but bad for the country where the firm is located, and hence there's benefits to one part that if my firm is doing well within a country, that is good for the country in itself, but that does not necessarily, if I shift all my profits outside, that's going to be negative. So the net implications of that are going to be complicated to figure out. And the more money goes in tax havens, the less productive it gets elsewhere. Yeah, I see this sort of as, that's one of the reasons why I didn't talk about causality or identification or whatever at all. The stuff that I'm observing so far is purely correlational, and I think to see whether this is an equilibrium or whether there's some long-term equilibrium even, then really the relationship between the what comes first and what comes second is going to be much more important to figure out before we can make any credible statements, or at least more credible statements about that.
Okay, and maybe Kristen indeed, so because I call it an equilibrium, but it's like if you look at the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Acts, sometimes bigger companies, that's the ultimate aim of governments, because it's easier to steer them, it's easier to influence them, etc. So how do you look at that?
I haven't necessarily thought of it like that. It's an important question, but yeah, the reason why I think this is so important to investigate or research is that these larger firms do have a lot of power, and to see how that is being used, whether it's tax avoidance or inflation. And that's also why I think it's natural for governments to want to target them, to make sure that the monopoly power is not getting too strong, or these things. But yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Alison. I see your hand up. Go ahead. You're still muted, it seems.
Sorry. Thanks a lot for telling me I'm muted, and thanks a lot for these presentations, which were super interesting. So I have two questions which are very small because it's just some method related things. The first one is to you, Benny. You have this interaction between this tax haven score and the FDI, basically implying that you have this linear relation. So the more tax havenery you get as a country, the less productive is the FDI. Would it make sense to rather assume that this is non-linear and saying, okay, we have these 10, let's say these 10 countries where usually somebody would invest without really wanting to have an economic benefit, and rather having a dummy in this interaction, which would also make your results easier to interpret?
That's a very fair point. I haven't looked at that, but it is true that currently I just assume that every unit movement on this tax haven score has the same implication, whether you're at 31, wherever that Belgium probably might be, or whether you're at Bermuda at 99, that's going to be the same thing. And that's probably not true. So I should really see whether there's some gradation in this, or I'm not sure whether a dummy approach necessarily is the right thing to do, because then I'm going to implicitly assume that the top ones or the worst ones, or that the effect there is going to be stronger, which, I mean, I'm doing that linearly now as well, but it's not clear that that's going to be a non-linear break at some point. But I do agree that I have to look at more non-linear relations between that, and that just assuming that it's linear is probably not going to be the ideal scenario.
I would actually even argue that it makes sense to say that a dummy approach is good, because let's say that capital is basically free to go wherever they want. So then if I have the capital to put somewhere, I could always choose the worst ones, right? So then you would just see the effect in the very, let's say, the 100 or 90 score countries. But I also understand the argument, but I think there would also be an argument to saying we shouldn't see anything from score 1 to score 90, and then the effect jumps in between 90 and 100.
Yes, I think the tipping point somewhere between it being positive and negative is somewhere around 80 something by now. So I do think that the vast majority of this negative implication of a tax haven is going to be driven by the largest ones.
Yeah, true.
I'm just a bit apprehensive about the dummy approach, because then I have to define where the cutoff is.
True.
But I can obviously generate smaller segments and indicate non-linearities in that sense, and see where the break actually happens, rather than impose the linearity that I do now. That's a good point.
Okay, maybe my second question was to you, Valeria. So I found that super interesting that you kind of track where the chains, or how the chains go. I was just struggling a little how should I interpret the Markov model in there? Because I just know Markov models from very different contexts. So I always have this idea in mind that you kind of erase path dependency. And I was wondering, would that mean that if I'm a company in the UK, then my path dependency in that model is not there, meaning that either I invest from the UK to the Netherlands or from the US to the Netherlands in the model, this would somehow, would it just be determined empirically, or how would it work?
So if I understand correctly, what you're asking basically is, so in the Markov models, so basically, yeah, as you said, like it's the first order, so I don't look at the previous steps. What we do is to understand if the previous steps are indeed important. Like if there's still some memory in the data, like the previous steps change the shape of our data set. This is what we are looking at. So if in this looking at the previous steps change the distribution that we obtain, then it means that this kind of memory, this kind of dependency on the previous steps is important. So, and basically how we do that, how, like in the model, how do we test if the higher orders, if these patterns that we find are in truth important? Basically, what we do is to construct the synthetic data. We put synthetic higher orders in the data. And if our model finds them, so this means that the model indeed is performing well. And then we apply this to the real data. But maybe I didn't catch your question, or I didn't answer completely. Is it this what you were asking?
No, I think that was helpful for sure. So thanks.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I see your hand up.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for amazing presentations. I'm really happy that we're having this workshop. It's great to see it all concentrated in 1 hour. Amazing work. I'll have a comment or a question for the presentation that I knew least about, and that's Benny's work, not surprisingly. So thank you for an excellent presentation, Benny. And I think you're addressing a very important research question there. And I understand that it's very much work in progress, and you mentioned some ways yourself how you'd like to extend it. And I just, like to offer a few pointers that I can follow up in email later on. Because if I understand your language of productive and unproductive, partly this might overlap with unproductive being profit shifting, and there are other various phrases that are being used for it. So, for example, there's a paper where, including co-authored by Niels Johannessen, who called it phantom investment, and there are several other papers where they try to disentangle that specifically. So that's an alternative research approach to yours, where you do take all the FDA data and then you try to sort it out in the regression. And so as a control or as a robustness check, what you could do, you could use the estimates where they have tried to separate it explicitly as flows or stocks. So there's the great research papers, one by co-authored and led by Dan Heberle, economy geographer from the University of Sussex. Another one is the one on phantom investments, Niels Johannessen and co-authors. And a third one is the Missing Profits of Nations by Ludwig Wier, Thomas Torslow, and Gabriel Zuckman. And of course, then Miroslav and me and others in our CORPTAX group have several papers where we have similar estimates, but I think those that I've mentioned before are at least as good or better. So there will be just pointers for in case you had a long to if in case your to-do list for this paper is not long enough already. Here are some more, but to make it more of a question. So are you thinking about profit shifting mainly by multinational corporations to tax havens, or you have in mind something more general or other specific types?
So far, I was thinking very general. Just the argument that the money that goes in is probably less productive or less generating economic activity in the strict, well, in a sort of a narrow sense of what we understand of economic activity, because I would rule out any sort of financial activities as not being productive economic activities. But I've come across the Ghost FDI, but I haven't heard of the Phantom version yet. That is kind of cool. I really think it would be useful to split up. I think that's a good idea, that I look at different types of FDI, because my argument would obviously rely on it just being negative for these specific types of FDI. So having measures for that would be extremely useful. So if you could send me the links to those papers, I would be extremely grateful. That sounds really cool.
Thank you. And just listening to this discussion, it relates to a note that I made also during your presentation, Benny. Whether you could somehow leverage the CBCR data that are now available for 3 years, and will soon be for 5 years, hopefully, where the misalignment could be directly observed. So some tax havens, to distinguish between productive and unproductive FDI, you could also check out whether the companies actually have economic activity there or just profits. Right? If they have just profits, then it's likely not to contribute so much to GDP growth. Yeah, but that might have to be a cross-country analysis at this point, and not the one that you're proposing. So.
Yeah, well, I guess the difficulty is that for that I would need to observe the firms themselves, and what I have now is just country level data. Obviously, I can do something with the share of the FDI, the share of the companies that produce FDI there that have local activity to at least get something of that sense, but. Or because I wasn't planning yet, but I'm sort of thinking about it after the discussion, move the analysis to the firm level. That might actually be certainly a way to actually get to some more of the identification strategies that might be useful to think about. While I'm talking, can I briefly ask a question to Valeria as well? We still have a couple of minutes, maybe. I think it's a really clever approach, but now you use these chains as to explain the effective tax rates, or at least the effects that they have on effective tax rate. I was actually wondering whether you could do it the other way around as well, whether you could think of these longer chains. If I start from the US, I first have to go to the Netherlands and then the Netherlands again before I end up in Russia and then in God knows where in the Bahamas. Whether for certain countries, these chains tend to be longer before the money hits a tax haven. And I would be kind of interested in see whether the length of these chains is determined by stuff from the starting company, like whether American countries with a more advanced financial system or a stronger legal framework, they have to make more of an effort to hide their money and then hence go through longer chains. I think that might be a kind of cool thing to see, whether there are some determinants of the length of these chains rather than use the chains as an explanatory variable in your case.
Yes, thank you for this observation. And indeed, yeah, that's why I was talking also about the financial, like correlate them with the financial secrecy index to see if there's some correlation with the financial secrecy index, because indeed maybe there could be that these are not the aim, but there could be just the mean. So maybe if they are used to maybe shift profits to little tax haven, like little island tax haven or something like that. Maybe it could be that, like something that allows multinational to have more secrecy, more favorable legislation, and that allows them to more easily shift the profits, not only to already then have a decreasing a lower tax rate, like corporate tax on the pattern themselves. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody, for a productive discussion, and thanks to the presenters for wonderful contributions. We have a break scheduled for now, about 10 minutes. So let's stay in the call, and I will see you back here in 10 minutes. Thanks so much.
Okay, so it seems to be 15:40. So welcome also from me, and I'm very happy to be at this workshop. And Christoph mentioned me and Mira that we organized the workshop, but I think most of the work was done by Mira. So thanks for that. It's great. You know, we had great first part, and now I hope we will follow up with the same. I'm Vita. I work at Utrecht University and as assistant professor of law and economics, and I coordinate DemoTrans at Utrecht University. We will now have sessions on public procurement and lobbying, sometimes combined, sometimes it's only lobbying or only public procurement. And without further ado, I would then ask Pele to present his preliminary work on innovation in public procurement. Specifically, the paper is called Driving Societal Change Through Public Procurement and Pre-Procurement Power Dynamics. Pele, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vita. Very nice to be here. Very brief introduction. Only 2 months ago, I started my PhD at the Innovation Studies section of the Copernicus Institute here in Utrecht. Yeah, and I'm as part actually of the DemoTrans project. So I'm very grateful to all of you who contributed to that project, because yeah, it led for me to this wonderful position. So very nice to meet you all. Yeah, so together with Anne Rainville, we're working on, in the context of Work Package 2, accountable corporations, and then specifically supplier and stakeholder engagement. And in that context, we will, towards September, work on a survey. And that's basically where this research that I'm going to present is based on. So as Vita said, some preliminary ideas after those first 2 months, inspired both by DemoTrans as well as our own backgrounds. So I will start briefly by discussing public procurement to drive societal change, and then by discussing our ideas on supplier engagement in the pre-procurement phase to stimulate innovative public procurement, and then a second topic, namely the role of power dynamics or influence or lobby, whatever you want to call it, in that regard. And lastly, a potential model that's attached to that, as well as some next steps. So regarding public procurement to drive societal change, I figured after 2 months that many papers on public procurement start with these kind of figures. But it does very nicely demonstrate the impact of public procurement, this large part of GDP here, 12.6%. And it also demonstrates, I think, the potential to use public procurement as a tool to drive societal change and to be a demand-side innovation policy to achieve goals in society. For example, here in the slide, you can see the goals or missions of Horizon Europe, on, for example, cancer, climate resilience, ocean waters. And yeah, public procurement really has the potential to in those areas develop new technologies, but also play a role in selecting the most promising technologies and diffuse them. However, still that potential is not optimally used, because we have to deal with vested interest or the selection often of the usual suspects. Also, tender documents are still often drafted based on more rigid technical specifications. So that means they describe the end products that public authorities desire instead of functional specifications. So that's more the problem they want to see solved. And if you describe that, of course, there's way more room for innovation on the road towards the solution. And lastly, we see a culture of risk aversion among public procurement officials. Yeah, so in all, procurement still does not enough stimulate or capture innovation from the market, and does not enough include innovative firms. So there are quite some ways to approach that issue during the tender process. For example, adjusting your selection criteria or splitting larger tenders into smaller lots. That makes them more approachable for SMEs. But another way where we're going to look at is supplier engagement before the tender actually has been drafted and launched. So there are some tools for public procurers to do so. For example, a prior art analysis. So you do research on what's already out there in the market, which can be supported by an intellectual property rights search. So you look for in national or international databases. You look for patents that are in line with the solution you're looking for. And with that information, you can start a market consultation. And approach market players with those solutions and discuss your needs with them and discuss the feasibility of the solutions. And then in the literature, it has been studied that this leads then to a more innovative procurement, because it helps public authorities to look beyond the usual suspects, and that in turn motivates the unusual suspects, the more innovative companies to more often participate in competitions. However, that literature on public procurement of innovation is often still based on case studies, and the larger end studies are often focused on the supplier perspective, and we found there still not that many studies that really look on the public side and have the larger end studies on that side. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do with the survey that I mentioned before. So in all this leads to a first research question, namely, how does early supplier engagement affect the innovativeness of public procurement? And then a second issue in relation to that is power dynamics, because traditionally public procurement is perceived as allowing very little room for that issue, power dynamics. Exactly because there are so many regulations that aim to ensure equity during the tender phase and minimize the potential for opportunism and power dynamics. But before the tender phase, so the pre-procurement phase that we're looking at right now, there's more room for suppliers and buyers to interact, for suppliers to communicate with buyers, and therefore also potentially to influence those buyers and steer them towards their preferred specifications in the tender, for example. So what we wanted to look at is then what happens if you aim to engage more with suppliers or interact more with them during this phase that actually is less regulated than the actual tender phase. Could this give more space for power dynamics, and then also could this negatively affect the efforts you're making to improve the innovativeness with engaging with those suppliers? Well, in brief, that leads to the research question: how do power dynamics affect the pre-procurement process? And that taps into a gap, a more general gap in studies of innovation policy. That's namely that the role of power is often neglected, and actors are perceived as neutral. So with the second issue, we want to look more into that. And in all, yeah, and intuitively, this leads to this preliminary model where we expect pre-procurement supplier engagement to positively influence the innovativeness of public procurement. But then when you add pre-procurement power dynamics, if we can detect those, we're curious to know if early supplier engagement increases power dynamics, and if that then in turn negatively influences innovative public procurement. But as I mentioned before, we can start refining and analyzing this model. We are going to gather the data ourselves through this survey, and that taps into the next steps, because the things we're figuring out right now is how to operationalize power dynamics, how to ask the right questions in that. That can be quite challenging and might need complementary methods. And secondly, what sample are we going to look at? EU-wide or a specific member state, or across member states? Those are the things we're looking at right now. As I said, those are very preliminary ideas after 2 months, so I'm very, very curious to your suggestions, either during this discussion or one-on-one. Here's my email, for example. So yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Pelle. So since there are still 3 minutes, it seems that Benny wants to ask a question, so I think that's completely fine to do it now.
Yeah, sure.
That's actually clapping hands rather than raising my hands.
Okay, then I misinterpreted it, but that's also a very positive thing to have. Good. Then I guess if there are no questions, then I will give the floor to Emily. The floor is yours. Good luck.
You're muted, Emily.
We don't hear you, Emily, now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I will share my screen with you now. Okay. Okay, here you go. So good afternoon, everyone. So first, I would like to say thank you very much for the formal presentation. It was super insightful for me. Before starting, I will just make a little bridge with what have been said until this point. So I will try to explain what is the purpose of my contribution regarding to what you guys has done in terms of research. So the main topic that has been addressed until now, it's how tax avoidance to influence either productivity or inequality, right? This kind of behavior took place because some people take advantages of legal framework or regulation, right? So with Vita, we had this idea to see, okay, so there is a set of a law that are supposed to be applied for everyone, but only a minute share of the population do actually influence the law, right? So we came with this title, basically, which is the power of the pen, political influence on the legislative procedure in Europe. So the motivation within this paper, as I said, is that like legal instruments are supposed to be applied to all of us, but only a minute share of the population will write actually the content of the law. To put it in a more realistic perspective, we may see it on our daily lives. If you check newspaper, for instance, with what's happened with the car targets or the influence of GAFAM. So GAFAM are those big tech companies such as Google, Amazon, Microsoft, so forth, so on. We may see that those big companies do actually influence the right of consumer rights. in a sense, we may also say that they to influence the sovereignty of countries, so indirectly the democracy, right? To be more specific, we may say that during the writing of the law, stakeholders are able to state their opinion about a first proposal of the law, but de facto, we want to see if those opinions are actually present in the final version of the law. So to put it simply, we want to see to which extent the writing of the law is democratic or not. So within this motivation, we stated a research question, which is the following. We want to check what are the effects of meetings between policymakers. So in our case, those are a rapporteur and the interest group, and to see to which extent they influence the final version of the regulation, and to which extent they do influence the writing of the law, in other words, in the legislative procedure. So this is our research question. So we have one main hypothesis, which is the following. So a meeting between a rapporteur or a shadow reporter with a representative from the interest group increases the chance of a favorable legislation being approved. So what I mean about favorable, you have to take it in a more relative perspective, because during the lawmaking, you have many stakeholders that are different interests. So for instance, you have the GAFAM that have their own interests, and after you may have like the civil society or like small and medium enterprises that want to defend their own interests, right? So it's all about relative, it's relative basically. So to address this question, we are going to work on a kind of unique set of data. So first, since 2014, there was like 432 regulations that has been voted in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, right? And for a subset of those regulations, we do have information of meetings between rapporteur and interest group. So this subsample is about 25 regulations where we know with whom the rapporteur met during the legislative procedures. So when I'm talking about stakeholders, I'm talking about a big set of actors, such as big firms, small and medium enterprises, civil society, and NGOs. All of them are more or less interested in the writing of the law. And to see if there is an influence of those meetings, what we intend to do is we want to take all those 25 regulations and to check for each amendment, how the amendment was modified throughout the legislative procedures. So what is nice about this data set is that we have those meeting information on very interesting acts, which are the Digital Service Act, the Digital Market Act, Data Governance Act, and Digital Operational Resilience Act. The other ones that are available in our data sets are related to energy. Some of them are related to energy and foreign subsidies. So basically, the idea is that I will work with those 25 regulations. Just to give you an idea about the amount of information we are going to work with, just if you take the Digital Service Act, we know that there's 84 meetings between rapporteur and the stakeholders. And within the procedures, there are 2,158 amendments that have been made. And aside, you have committees that are writing reports, assessing their, listing their opinion. But keep in mind that those committee opinions are only there to give advice on the text, but are not responsible for the writing of the law. For those of you who are not really familiar with the policy making in Europe, usually it follows several steps. So first you have the commissions that submit a first draft of the proposal that is written by the rapporteur, and this first draft is given to the parliament that has to provide amendments. So after you have also the council that make amendments of amendments, basically. So in the case of our work, we are going to focus on those, the first reading of the parliament and the second reading of the parliament, but also the one that is provided by the council. Keep in mind that usually the lion's share of the regulation usually with the first reading is enough, but depending on the sensitivity of the topic, it might require more steps. So if I take the example of the Digital Service Act, this act takes all the steps. For empirical approach, so the level of observation is we have an act that have a lot of amendments, and those amendments are linked to a meeting with the stakeholders, right? Our main outcome of interest is a binding index. So what is a binding index? Usually when you're a lawyer, it's kind of complicated to interpret the law, but some of what we intend to do is to use legal text and trying to make an index in order to see if the amendment is more binding or less binding relatively to a set of stakeholders. So this is really important information, but the binding index is really relative to one specific stakeholder. Say you have Google that meet with a rapporteur. Usually the main intuition we do have is that Google wants the law to be less binding in order to have more space of action, right? And in the other sense, you may have like a civil society that want to protect the right of consumers. So the civil society wants the law to be more binding. So basically, this binding index will capture those two perspectives, and it might sound kind of complex, but it's not as complex as it sounds. So basically, what I intend to do is I want to use linguistic features in order to capture, to categorize each word of these amendments and to try and to make link of dependency between those two words. Some amendments, when you go throughout the documents, it's kind of straightforward to whom it benefits and to who it does not benefit, right? So this is our main outcome of interest. If you have questions after, you can just ask about it. A second or other variable of interest is the meetings. So we have meetings for 25 regulation, and we might want to categorize those meetings into two main categories. The first one are the interested stakeholders and the motivated stakeholders. Let me explain. So for one regulation, usually what's happened before is that people like firms or civil societies, they can write a position letter in order to share their position regarding the law, the content of the law. And second, you have those within this population, you have two subpopulations, the ones that do actually meet with reporter and the ones that do not meet with reporter. So what is the motivation? So usually when you show up in a meeting is that it's the main reason is that you want to actually influence the content of the law, or you want to secure your interest. You're kind of a gatekeeper, right? And for those that are interesting in the law but that do not show up, the reason can be the following. Either they know the amendment will be voted, or they know that in any case that the amendment will be in their interests, their preferences, so they don't have really reason to show up, right? So basically, put it simply, only the stakeholders that want to change the content will show up. This information is important for explaining the model afterwards. So we came out with this model basically. So the explained variable is the favorable change of the binding index relatively to the specified stakeholders. So the favorable change of the binding index may be different for either the GAFAM, so Google, Microsoft, so forth, so on, and the right of consumer, right? We basically upload this regression, and the variable of interest is a meeting. So here the unit observation is the amendments within the regulation R. And we know that this meeting happened with, we know all the stakeholders that are present in the meeting, right? And after we plot controls and fixed effect for regulation and the stakeholders. So basically, here you see just one line, but what we aim to do is to replot this regression for each version of the amendments. And as you might have recall, as I said earlier, there's the procedure of the legislative procedure has each stage at a time. So for each stage, I will just plot this regression in order to see within the box, let's say, what's happened for each amendment. And I will plot a second model, which basically just take the first. So this is the second model, and it takes the basically it will capture this difference through the votes, and we only focus from the first version of the from the proposal until the end with the final version of the act. So keep in mind also, earlier on, I mentioned this idea with that only stakeholders that want to change the content will show up. Because of that, we expect a beta to have a donor bias. So here we will be only able to provide the lower bound estimates, but we are not able to quantify exactly the upper bound. So I finished my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention. Feel free to contact me if you have any question about that. And I'm looking forward for you to come in. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Emily. Great. I don't see anyone like raising hand. I guess that will happen only at the end. So I will give the floor to myself, actually. So let me share my slides. Cool. So I will talk about the favoritism in public procurement. So I kind of merged the two topics we just had, right? Some sort of like lobbying or influence and public procurement contracts. This is an older work, so I have full set of results, I think. And it's a joint work with Bruno. So let me tell you a short story that will just like very briefly illustrate of what we want to study, and then I will quickly jump into the data and the results because yeah, I have only 13 minutes. So the story is as follows. In 2005, there was a local businessman called Řebíček, and he owned a small construction company. For all the Czechs in the audience, I guess this is a known case. And this guy, Řebíček's company, had revenue from public procurement of about 25 million US dollars. And then in the following year, in 2006, he had this idea that he could run in the elections, and he actually got elected to the Chamber of Deputies and became a new Minister of Transport. He sold the company officially, but somehow remained connected as an external consultant. Anyway, what I find fascinating from this story is that like in the two following years, 2007 and 2008, the firm received procurement contracts in the total value of 150 million. So per year, 3 times as much as before. And this is kind of the story that we want to study. We want to study the effects of personal connections of firms to politicians on the public procurement markets, performance, and costs. Why do we want to study this? So clearly, I will now repeat, for example, Pele, who mentioned that, like, you know, these markets are huge. They constitute something like 1/7 of GDP in OECD countries. In the Netherlands, it's even more. It's 20%. In Czechia, it's more like 14%. So in almost any country in the world, this is a huge market. And we so far know that these firms with connections, they get many contracts. They get more contracts that would be proportionate to, you know, how big they are and so on. So they are very successful on this market somehow. And what's less clear is a research question that was posed long time ago by Andre Schleifer and Vishny, and they ask, like, but is this a problem? Is this type of favoritism harmful or efficiency enhancing? You can imagine stories where there are savings on red tape and other costs that political connections can lower. And so this is exactly what we want to study in this paper. Like, is it harmful? Is it efficiency enhancing? And if it is somehow harmful, if there are additional costs, what are these costs? Let me give you a brief overview of the results. before I explain how we get to these results. So political connections of firms, according to our estimates, leads to higher prices by about 6.5%, while there are no gains in terms of quality. So from this, we made a simple conclusion, like connections are harmful. They have adverse effects on performance of contracts. We estimate that the total cost of this type of favoritism, so this very specific type of like connection between a politician and a firm, nothing like donations or other things, but just this one type, is about 0.4% of the value of the market. And interestingly, especially like since DemoTrans is like an EU project or Horizon Europe project, interestingly, additional oversight that is induced by EU co-funding seems to mitigate these adverse effects. So that's like the good part of our story. Like we find that, okay, connections are harmful, but additional oversight can mitigate these effects. So that's actually an interesting policy recommendations potentially. We think that the main contribution we have is that we quantify very precisely the total costs, additional costs for the public sector, and have some suggestive evidence on the role of oversight, which is also new. Let me tell you something about the market quite briefly. In Czechia, most procurement contracts are lowest price sealed bid auctions. In our data, these auctions are administered by different procuring authorities, ministries, regions, and municipalities. And they are all regulated by the same law, which for us has the advantage that, we work with the same type of auctions. And interestingly, a nice feature of the law is that there has to be an engineering cost estimate done before any contract is run or launched. And that helps us with like quantifying whether a contract is overpriced or not. In the end, we work with something like 34,000 contracts that are worth roughly $22 billion US. And the period that we studied from 2006 to 2018. As you can see on this picture, just an illustration that like log of estimate is very strongly correlated with logarithm of price. So these cost estimates are good predictors of the final prices. You can say that these estimates, they explain about 93% of the variation in the final prices. So that's just to tell you, look, these estimates that we have, that they're good, and we can use them in the analysis. This is not the case in all countries. That's why I show this graph to make you believe that these costs are useful. So that was about the procurement data, right? But we need also the data on political connections. So what we do is that we construct a data set of personal connections using data that are publicly available in Czechia. One piece of data that we have is data on firms. So we know for all Czech firms who were their statutory representatives, so members of the boards and members of the supervisory boards, and we know also about some owners, not all of them, certainly. This in our data is about 3.2 million records. So this is not 3.2 million different persons necessarily, but just records. There can be the same people in multiple companies. They can be, multiple times in board and so on over time. And then we have information about all election candidates since 2004. That's about 740,000 records. We match these two data sets on name, age, and the city of residence. We also make sure that there are not many mismatches. I will not go into detail how, but what we have in the end is about 3,500 political connections. And then let me just explain that when we talk about political connection, it has time specificity. So we talk about a connection only in that particular year, and a connection is there if you are connected, if a firm is connected to the party in power. That's why we need time, right? Parties in power change over time. What's the variation that we use are elections. In our period of study, there are 11 elections on different levels, municipalities, regions, and ministries. You can see them all in the table. And they result in about 370 changes in the party in power. Why is this nice? This is what we can then exploit, right? We can then basically compare like how overpriced a contract is when a firm is connected to the party in power versus when it is not, when it loses the connection, or when it is not yet connected but gains connection later. And so these are the changes in power that we exploit. So basically the empirical strategy that we will have is two-way fixed effects estimation with the treatment switching in and out. So it can be multiple times that a firm is connected to the party in power, then it loses the connection, and then again it gets connected. This brings some empirical challenges. You know, if you follow the discussion on difference in differences estimation with staggered treatment, you know that there are many new estimators, and there are many issues with the approaches that were used till something like 2019 or 20. And so we use these new methods, and I will show you that our results are robust to using these new methods. Finally, before I show you some results, let me tell you just simple summary statistics. But I think already this suggests that these firms are kind of special and they have some better access to contracts than others. So first of all, about 1.3% of all contractors are connected. But these 1.3% of contractors, they get about 2% of contracts. So disproportionately more. And these contracts are also more valuable. So these connected firms, they get about 6% of the total value of contracts. So you can see that these firms get many contracts and they are more valuable than other contracts. Than contracts that are supplied by non-connected firms. What is our empirical approach? Basically, we have the following specification as the main approach, and we then test whether using these alternative estimators show similar results or not. In this specification, relative price, so the ratio of the final price divided by estimated costs, whether that is influenced by the connection. How do we define the connection? Connection is specific to procuring authority, firm, and time. So it basically tells whether there is a connection, let's say, between a firm and a city, and this connection must be valid, meaning that like the party to which a firm is connected is currently in power. And so you can see that this connection dummy can switch, and that is what we will exploit when we control for procuring authority firm fixed effects, because then our beta will basically tell us something like, what is the difference in relative price when a very similar contract was delivered in the time when there was a connection present between the supplier and the firm, and when there was no connection. We add some control variables, like we control for industries, for months fixed effects, for age of firms, and so on. This age of firms is motivated by our test of balance between like firms that get positive shocks in connections versus those that do not. we then acknowledge that, this approach to a fixed effect estimation has some problems potentially. So we use the recent methods by Schoss-Martin and I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his name, but like Schoss-Martin and his co-author, the paper from 2020 in AER, we use this methodology and test basically how sensitive our results are probably to the potential issues with two-way fixed effect estimation. This suggests that it's unlikely to be a big problem, and this is then confirmed when we run the regressions using these other estimators. So you can see in the first column that the two-way fixed effect estimate using the specification that I show you on the slides shows some effect of roughly 6%. When we use the Schoss-Martin method, which is the third column, the estimated effect is roughly 6.3%, so very, very similar. And finally, we also tried Gartner's method, which again should be solving the issues that we face in the two-way fixed effect estimation, and the measured effect is about 8%, so still very similar in magnitude and significant. So just to interpret this suggests that the prices are about 6% higher when contracts are delivered by connected firm. That should be the effect of the connection, a 6% increase in the price. But you can imagine that, you get a politically connected company that charges a bit more money, but delivers in amazing quality. And so then there is no problem in terms of welfare. Maybe it's unfair, but in terms of welfare, it's not a problem. And so what we do is that we measure quality and then try to estimate what is the effect of connections on quality. How do we measure quality? Let me just very briefly explain the idea. I don't want to go into details, but we look on the construction sector, and we basically just test whether we measure whether there are many repairs afterwards. So our idea is that if you have two roads and then one road doesn't need to be repaired and the other road is like every year repaired, then probably the road number 2 with many repairs is of low quality. And we can also really measure what is the value of repairs, so how much it costs. So we have not like a binary variable or just comparison, but we really can measure what are the additional costs of repairs that follow up. And what we find is that there is no significant effect. The estimates are positive, but note that here a positive number means more repairs, not less. So what we can say is that there is insignificantly more repairs when contracts are delivered by connected firms. And finally, let me say one small thing about the oversight before I conclude. We have a suggestive evidence on the effect of additional oversight that comes with contracts that are co-funded by the European Union. And what we find is that if there is oversight from a higher level of government on a lower level of government, then this oversight fully mitigates the effect of political connections, while the oversight that is done on the same level of government, so let's say a ministry or a national agency supervises a ministry, then the effect is not mitigated at all. So this kind of tells something about how oversight should be designed and when it has effects and when it doesn't have the effects that are desired. We run a lot of robustness checks, and then we also try to calculate the total cost of this type of favoritism. This is a very simple calculation, so for the sake of time, I will skip it, but I will tell you how much it's on this final conclusion slide. So let me recap the main results before I do that. And the main result is that procurement contracts allocated to connected firms are overpriced by roughly 6%. They're not delivered in higher quality. And we estimate that the total cost of this favoritism is roughly 0.4% of the value of the market. Good. So this is it from me. Let me stop sharing my slides, and I will give the floor now back to Mira again, who will talk about procurement and tax haven. So indeed joining the two main topics of this workshop.
Thanks, Vita. Yeah, yes, exactly. So before I do that, I would actually like to hijack the scientific program for a very small, brief moment. And if I could ask you if you'd like to be in a group picture, if you would turn on your video for a second, and I will just take a quick screenshot. Thank you. All right. Great. Thanks very much. All right. Anyone else? Yeah, I see some other people joining. Perfect. All right, then 3, 2, 1, smile. There we go. Okay, thanks very much. Let's set this. Okay, and I'll share my screen. All right, so yeah, the topic of our paper is, I think, very nicely connecting the two sessions. So very closely tied to Vita's work and also to the work of the whole first session, which is on tax havens or corporate tax avoidance. The title of the paper is "How Much Public Procurement Money Ends with Companies Linked to Tax Havens." His joint work with Petr, who's here at the call, and Jiří Skuhrovec, a colleague from Datlab, a Czech company. Now, so this is coming to the problem of public procurement, but from the perspective of tax havens. So when we start sort of to position this work in the area of tax havens, we know that large amounts of corporate profits are shifted to tax havens. Estimates talk about 400 to 600 billion US dollars annually, which results in huge losses to corporate tax revenue. So when we have a little overview of what we can do about this, I classify those into three main types of solutions. The first is to reform the international tax system. That might be happening at the level of the United Nations or the OECD, the European Union, any type of international organization that might speak to this. So there's a lot of initiatives that are trying to solve the issue from this perspective, and to varying success. There is some development, definitely. The second possible way to fight profit shifting to tax havens is to shame the tax havens, right? So in this area, we know about the EU blacklists of tax havens. We know about the corporate tax haven index, has been mentioned a couple of times here. Various rankings of tax havens, classifications of either binary or more continuous measures of how much each country acts as a tax haven. And then the third part is to shame or boycott companies that actually use tax havens. There are two types of those initiatives. It could be classified into private sector solutions and public sector solutions, where in the private sector, perhaps we could mention tools such as the Fair Tax Mark, which assigns a mark to companies that don't avoid tax by shifting profits to tax havens. But what we want to focus on in this paper is the very last bullet point, and that is the public sector, where government expenditures, it's been mentioned a couple times already today, are in the form of public procurement or EU funds, bailout, COVID-19 aid, etc., amount to huge amounts of money. And so what we're asking in this paper, whether we could leverage that to fight profit shifting by multinationals. So a little bit of background about public procurement in the European Union. So around 2 trillion euros are spent annually in public procurement, but very little is known about the companies that supply these tenders. So from the existing literature, we know some about the theory, which companies focus on supplying tenders to the public sector. There are some case studies that have been looking at individual companies, individual types of fraud. There is also the work of Vita and others looking at politically connected companies and how much they supply public tenders. So we have heard from Vita that politically connected companies might be among those disproportionately obtain public procurement tenders. And what we're asking here is how many of these suppliers are linked to tax havens. So sort of leading from that as in the area of policy is, what if the government decided not to buy goods and services from such companies, to perhaps boycott them or discriminate against them at least a little bit in the public procurement contracts? That's also something that we discuss in this paper. And we talk a little bit about the two principles at the EU level of non-discrimination versus fair competition, and the interplay of these two principles. So once we allow for profit shifting by multinationals to enter the picture, where you don't want to discriminate against any companies. So if they have a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, there's no reason to discriminate against them. That's one view. There is also the view of fair competition. So if a company has subsidiaries in tax havens, perhaps they might be able to offer lower prices for tenders, and then as a result win disproportionate amounts of tenders because they were able to provide a lower bid to the public procurement tender. So a lot of progress has been made in sort of the transparency, both down here on the corporate side as well as the tender side. And all of these initiatives sort of allowed together the existence of this line of work that I'm presenting to you now. So on the tender side, we now have good data, partly thanks to the DigiWist project, which is the source of data for us here in this paper about public procurement tenders. And on the corporate side, with country-by-country reporting and Orbis and intensive tax haven research that has led to a good understanding, let's say, of the world of tax havens and how companies use tax havens. So all of those together combine into the possibility of carrying out this study. So what we do for the first time is to explore how much EU public money goes to companies linked to tax havens, and sort of provide a set of stylized facts about this, about the area of public procurement and how those companies are tied to tax havens. We show which tax havens are important for public procurement suppliers in Europe. And we develop a model of supplier choice by contracting authorities, basically how any contracting authority from the public sector is making a decision of who to choose for the provision for the supply of a given public procurement tender. Now, we have from that model stemming a couple of hypotheses about why firms that are linked to tax havens are chosen disproportionately often. So I already hinted at that they might be, in theory, able to provide a lower bid for the public procurement tender. And so if price is a selection criterion for the contracting authority, then they might select companies linked to tax havens disproportionately often. And we also show, we go to the tender level in the last part of the analysis, and we show which tenders are most vulnerable to this disproportionate supply of tenders by companies linked to tax havens. All right, so a little bit about the data. I already said we use the data on public procurement from the DigiWist project that are now publicly available at the website opentender.eu. So this combines the Tenders Electronic Daily, which is a EU-wide source of data on public procurement, with national sources, which complement the Tenders Electronic Daily for the sort of smaller contracts. So anything above a threshold goes to the TED, the Tenders Electronic Daily, and then we combine it with smaller tenders from the national sources. So this would be for each country, their respective register of public procurement contracts. So the data covers the period 2006-2019, roughly 13 million tenders from 31 countries around Europe is the sample that we are looking at. We combine that public procurement data with data on ownership structures of companies. For that, we use the Orbis database. And we are able to match about 2.5 million tenders with a supplier that is found in Orbis. So obviously there are problems with the public procurement data, that not all of the tenders data includes an ID that would be searchable in Orbis. Also, Orbis does not have a full coverage of all companies in the world, as we have been shown by some very nice evidence And so the intersection basically of the two data sets results in a sample of 2.5 million tenders. So what we look at is for these 2.5 million tenders and their suppliers, we look at the countries that are present in the ownership structure of those companies. So we go upward in the ownership structure, and we look at the countries that are present in the sort of mother companies structure of each company that is supplying the tender. One of the drawbacks of this methodology is that we don't look at sister companies, which in theory also allow to shift profits to tax havens, even though in a less straightforward way. But that's a limitation sort of the available data that we had. All right, so let's peek at the stylized text that I talked about. So here, this chart shows you the share of tenders. This is by value, not by number of tenders, that are supplied to European countries by companies that have links to individual foreign countries. So the countries on the left there are the countries that companies are tied to. So these are the top 30, Netherlands being present in about almost 13% of tenders by value that are supplied to European countries. So in the ownership structure of companies. Now, this doesn't really show you a list of tax havens, and as one might expect. That is because larger countries are more likely to be present in the ownership structures of companies. And so, for example, the United States, it makes sense that they're at the top of this ranking because it's just a big economy, right? So a lot of companies will have a US-based company in their ownership structure. But there are some red flags here, such as Bermuda, with a relatively high share, so higher than Japan or Finland, for example. So for such a small country, it's a big number. So to look at that more closely, we make a relative of this to the country's GDP. Okay, so when we divide this number by the country's GDP, we basically see a list of tax havens. So this is a bar chart of the value of tenders supplied to European countries by firms linked to individual countries as a share of that country's GDP. Okay, so we are looking at the value of tenders supplied divided by the GDP of that country, okay, to give us a measure of how disproportionate that amount is compared to the size of the economy. So basically what we would expect if these countries had not been acting as tax havens. So we actually see that these shares are huge for some countries. So for example, just to put this into perspective, for Bermuda and British Virgin Islands, these are about 900% of the GDP of those countries are, that's the amount of money that is supplied only to European countries by companies that have those countries' subsidiaries in their ownership structure. Okay. So for those economies, these numbers are really huge. We also look at the relationship between the value of tenders supplied by companies tied to individual countries and the country's effective corporate income tax rate. So basically, we would expect that countries that act as tax havens will score higher on this metric of the value of tenders as a share of that country's GDP. We do find strong evidence for that. We also provide regression analysis results in the paper, and basically confirming that if a country has a relatively low effective corporate income tax rate, it can expect to see a lot of companies being in the ownership structure of suppliers of European companies. So on the level of individual tax havens, very good predictors of which tax havens will be at the top of this ranking are low corporate tax rates, academic and some institutional lists of tax havens. What we find as a relatively bad predictor is the European Union's blacklist of non-cooperative jurisdictions. So there is not a strong correlation between the blacklisted countries and the values that we see here in our results. Now, when we look at the tender level, this will be relatively quick. We look at which types of tenders are vulnerable more to this disproportionate value of tenders supplied by companies linked to tax havens. So our model basically predicts that if the cost of using a tax haven is relatively high, to test that, we actually look at tenders that are funded by the EU or co-funded by the EU and that are not co-funded by the EU. The hypothesis being that the EU-funded tenders are more likely to be audited, and so using a tax haven if you're a company that supplies that tender, is relatively costly compared to supplying a tender that is not EU co-funded, so less likely to be audited. We also look at competition, the number of bidders, and we find that the number of bidders is important indeed. So tenders with lower amount of bidders are more likely supplied by companies tied to tax havens. So just to show you some of these results, here's the difference between the EU funded and the non-EU funded tenders, and the share of these tenders that are supplied by companies linked to tax havens. So the EU funded, you see, are much lower as a share of the value that is supplied by such companies tied to tax havens. And if we look at the bidders, we see relatively straightforward confirmation of our hypothesis that the lower the number of bidders, the higher is the share of tenders that are supplied by companies linked to tax havens. So in conclusion, we find that EU public procurement is supplied disproportionately by firms linked to tax havens. In terms of scale, we find that around 5% of all tenders, which roughly translate to 150 billion euros annually, goes to companies that are tied to tax havens with their ownership structure. Now, remember, none of this includes any tax havens that are within the European Union. So this is only for the gray listed and the blacklisted tax havens outside of the EU by definition. And we find that tenders that are more likely to be supplied by companies linked to tax havens are those that are not co-funded from EU funds and those with fewer bidders. So as a measure of competition. That is all for me. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mira. Super interesting. I think now I will first give floor to Lucian Serma to comment generally on the papers, and I guess Lucian will have many questions and comments.
Yes, well, hello everyone. I was very happy to be roped in this interesting project and conference now a bit from a tangent. I wasn't fully aware of the very detailed and very interesting research that has been funded by the European Commission in this important area, and I'm glad to see that despite the difficulties, and as someone who has been active in both as the former chief economist in DigiTrade and now as someone in charge of public procurement, knowing how difficult it is to get reliable, comparable cross-country data on public procurement, and then not only to get that kind of data, but also to have a firm level matching with other company data from other sources. It's a daunting task. So I can only commend the researchers who engage in such projects. I think they are very useful for us who are now called upon much more frequently than in the past to put in place sensible policies that will maximize the potential of public procurement. Just to, again, I think it came across from many presentations that both within the single market, among all the European economies, but also globally, public procurement matters a lot more than before. We have a new rejuvenation, a reinvention of industrial policies, or a lot of state intervention that started during the COVID period for perhaps good reasons at the beginning. But now we see a number of measures that make public procurement more complicated, more fragmented, and probably not necessarily more transparent, and not necessarily more competitive in a way that would give people good value for money when it comes to the important role that public procurement plays, not just for citizens in general, but also for a good economic outcome in terms of innovation procurement, green procurement. So there are many objectives that this sector can probably stimulate. Now, What I derived from the presentations and the little time I had available to go through the reach level of findings and metrics and possible conclusions was that it is, I think it is worrying indeed that despite us trying to have a very integrated single market, there is still a fairly limited number of cross-border procurements. There is a very large number of contracts where you see only single bidders, and single bidders may be a symptom or a signal of some imperfections and maybe some dysfunctionalities in that market, in that sector. I saw it used as a metric in some of your analysis. It's also one of the key metrics for our single market scoreboard, the kind of indicators that we use regularly to check the health of the European public procurement single market. So it is now interesting to see that one could add to those indicators other, I would say, red flags that one could find. And I think this possibility to look very deeply into the ultimate ownership, the kind of Orbis data that has been used, for instance, in one of the papers, opens interesting avenues, precisely and particularly because now we have, at least at the European level, but also globally, much more interest on really knowing where the public money goes, whether there is fair competition, or maybe whether some companies, through their complex corporate structure, benefit from unfair advantages. And one of these is through tax havens. The other one could be through subsidization or through having indirectly access to other kinds of policies that will distort competition in a particular tender. So I think this is the kind of information that is relevant for two new pieces of European legislation that have been adopted recently. One is the foreign subsidies regulation. So if companies bid for European public contracts, and it turns out that they received the subsidies from a foreign government, now this new regulation will allow the Commission to investigate this sort of unfair competition. It's a bit of an anti-dumping for public procurement, if you want, or anti-subsidy investigations on public procurement. So it's the type of regulation that would require the kind of information you've been using in your econometric analysis. One would need to know corporate linkages in order to establish whether, say, a headquarter company or a subsidiary in another third country received a subsidy from a foreign government. The second piece of legislation that may require the kind of the very rich, detailed, firm-level analysis that we have been carried out in some of these papers is the international procurement instrument. Again, here, where if at the end of a legal procedure, the European Union will have to impose restrictions on bidders from third countries. It's again very important to understand whether a company is a letterbox company, whether it's an affiliate with or without substantive business operation, and maybe with ultimate ownership in countries that will be subject to such sanctions. So all of them, the kind of things I could see now, I was multitasking and watching and listening to some of your presentations. I think you are on the right track of creating valuable information for policymakers. It's the kind of things that we at the Commission do not have the time and the luxury of, sometimes not even the analytical skills to do all these high-level analysis. So I'm glad that we were smart enough to finance such research projects, and I look forward to the the next level of your analysis, where hopefully, for instance, if I caught some of the arguments that Miroslav made, we are also heavily advocating for the introduction of a single identifier, a single company identifier that would be available not just for procurement in Europe, or not just for tax, VAT, or other kinds of purposes. So a single company identifier that can cut across different policy areas. We've seen how convenient it is sometimes our bureaucratic silos for companies. They can navigate our silo mentality, and they can do things which are probably suboptimal simply because we in the procurement world do not talk to the people in the taxation world, we do not talk to people in the I don't know which other policy area. So one single company identifier throughout Europe, and maybe even globally, because I think there is a UN or a global initiative to allow each company to have a single unique identifier. That would simplify a lot the transparency and the regulatory cooperation we will need to have with other jurisdictions in order to avoid the kind of issues that we have identified. It's not going to be easy, and it will take more than just a research project, but I think, as I said, I think you are into something important, and I'm grateful for all your useful work. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to give the word to Mira because, as I mentioned to him, I have to leave. But thank you very much, Lucian. I'm sorry that I have to leave just now when you finished.
Thank you so much, Lucian. This is super insightful, and it's great to hear that we are on the right track for one, and that you as a policymaker, find this relevant and important. It's very encouraging to hear. Are there any questions from the audience? I don't see any hands up as of now. Okay, I do now. Benny, please go ahead.
Yes, there's a lower hand button. That is cool. I had a small question about this, about your paper actually in the end, because this your final data set uses sort of like 20% of the tenders you start with. You have like 13 million, and then there's 2.6 million. So I'm wondering whether there could be some selection issue in terms of the chance that firms that have links to tax havens are less likely to found in the Orbis data set, for whatever reason that may be, and how that might affect the results that you have, which sort of made me think a bit about Pelle's presentation in the beginning, because the selection of the people that he's going to interview is going to be crucially important here as well. You want to have a representation that is, you want to have a selection that's sufficiently representative that you don't get any biases that come with that. And closely related to that, I found this EU blacklist finding quite interesting, and I wondered whether that changes after Brexit. So you might think that there's a lot of lobbying for the British Virgin Islands and whatever, that British companies that are linked to that are kept off the list and these kind of things. Maybe that weakens once Brexit was implemented. So there might be a break in these kind of things, that countries tend to lobby to get other ones not on the list and whatever based on political circumstances, which might be interesting to look at.
Thanks, Benny. I think those are very relevant points. Yes, the sample selection problem is there. We sort of acknowledge it in the paper. It's pretty much there is not much we can do about it, I guess, from our perspective. I think it just highlights the need for better data, more transparency in the area of both ownership structures and public procurement. So I welcome a lot the initiative that Lucian has mentioned about the single company identifier. So obviously Orbis is very much imperfect, and it would be great to have a better coverage, better information about the companies that are in question. Well, I don't know if you'd like to add something to that, or good.
Me? No, thanks.
I was more thinking about which type of criteria you might have in mind in terms of selection of who you're gonna include in your survey, since you didn't mention too much about that.
Yeah, so the survey, the so to say basic the first thing we have is that it's going to be directed towards public procurement officials, but of course, then still you have a lot of room for maneuver or many decisions to make, so to say, in terms of countries and sectors and those kind of things. And that's what I meant with what we're still figuring out in the end. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Christoph, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. So also thank you, Lucian, for this interesting comment. So indeed, so I guess one of the outcomes in the DemoTrans project can also be what red flags can we consider. So how can we construct from the various insights that we obtain from the research similar red flags? So I think that's a very interesting comment that we can take with us. So thanks a lot for that. So you have to wait maybe till the next webinar until we can discover that, but it's anyway a good way to reflect on that. And I do have a question also for Emily. So Emily, in your presentation, it seems a little bit like that the meeting is negative, but of course, I imagine that policymakers, they don't meet with regular people. So they meet with selected people, with people with good knowledge, etc. And this creates obviously some selection effects. How do you deal with that in your paper, or how can you distinguish this?
So first, like regarding your first comment regarding like the beta is necessarily negative, it really depends. So let's say you have two main stakeholders, either GAFAM, either consumers. Consumer want to protect their rights. It really depends the sense how you interpret the binding, because sometimes, for me, the lion's share from what I've seen about the amendments is that the less binding, the better is for enterprises, but sometimes they might want to add clauses within the legal text, maybe to protect their interests. Like, for instance, this not apply to firm X, blah, 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 so forth, so on. So, but yes, it will be some of the cases, it might be positive. So in the case of consumer, it might be positive because they want to protect their interest, right? They don't want to lose their rights regarding, like in the case of the digital realm, right? So for the second case, so your point is that the rapporteur meets with the specific stakeholders, right? So let's say they have more sources, they're more aware of what's happening within the procedures. We thought about this question, but for empirical exercise here, I have to think about it more, but basically we just want to explore the fact that we have information on transparency for specific regulation, and even though it's we also made the hypothesis that some of those meetings might not be referred, but at least we have this information. And our point is that so since there is a law on transparency that has been voted, what I wanted to do is to make a live papers that the more regulations that we voted in 2023, the more regulation we'll have with this component transparency. So yes, that's the purpose. But for regarding the endogeneity, I have to evacuate it, like to address this question from the introduction. So I'm still thinking about it. So
okay, thanks.
But like as I say in the presentation, we will be able to provide a lot. There will be a downward bias, but we be able to estimate the lower bound. But we know that's more happened, but we cannot quantify it. We can quantify it from the lower bound from the data we do have regarding transparency.
Okay, and maybe I did also have a question for Vita, but Vita wisely left in time before the question, so but maybe Mira or Pelle, you can answer it. But so Vita argued also that additional oversights might mitigate the effects, but obviously, and that's again the policy implementation of that. So if you might have additional oversights, but this triggers all kind of red tape, and people, of course, are very much against the red tape. So how would you be able to create a kind of equilibrium there as well between, mitigating the negative effects by additional oversight and reducing red tape? Maybe from your background or experience or research, you can see potential angles there. Or maybe Lucian as well, so maybe you can also comment. because I guess this one of the things that we need to discuss later on in our policy recommendations as well. On, yeah, you might have more oversight, but then, yeah, what about negative effects due to that? What about red tape, etc.? Because of course this also kills the economy.
Lucian, would you like to come in?
Well,
Please go ahead.
I see a general point about red tape, and whenever as a public official you put in place new requirements or new legislation, you should consider that. And we do have very thorough rules on minimizing the administrative costs on, especially on small enterprises and etc. Many other key stakeholders. I personally believe that with the current wave of digitalization and with a single for instance, in procurement, or with this principle that applies across many areas in many member states of submitted once, never asked again, or submitted somewhere and being used elsewhere. It's only a matter of us allowing ourselves as public administrations and to have the consent from the users to reuse their data, or to use the data from one context to another. And if that is accepted as a principle, that would allow you to optimize processes. You can always opt out if you want. You know, if you can choose red tape and more privacy, or vice versa. So there are probably there is a careful balance to be kept in mind, but with the new ways in which we do business, where information is no longer that difficult to exchange or to preserve in the system without asking people to add new administrative requirements, I think that's the way to go. And I've seen it in some instances working very well.
Okay, thanks. So then we need more big tech papers, basically. Yeah? So bigger companies. So, and therefore we need to reduce the taxes, tax havens for them, just that they can strengthen their roles. Huh?
I think this is a good place to finish then. All right, the time is up anyway. So I would like to thank everybody for participating today. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for all the wonderful contributions. Thanks, Lucian, for joining us. All right, see you next time then. Watch this space for more similar outputs. All right, cheers.
Thanks a lot.